The gunshot split the frozen air before Mara Whitlock even saw the gate. She stumbled backward, hungry and hollow-eyed, staring at the bullet hole in the dirt 6 inches from her boots. The foreman, lean, cold, a man built from wire and contempt, levered another round into his rifle without blinking. "Turn around," he said. "Nothing here for the desperate." But Mara didn't move. Behind that gate stood warmth, food, a chance to stop running, and she was done running. If you want to see how a starving widow survives in a town that wants her gone, stay until the end. Hit like, and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The wind off the plains carried the smell of dust and dry grass, and it cut through Mara's coat like she wasn't wearing one at all. She'd walked 14 miles since dawn, her boots held together with twine and prayer, and her stomach had stopped growling 2 days ago. Now it just ached, a dull, persistent thing she'd learned to ignore the way you ignore a bruise that won't heal. Ashridge Hollow sat in a shallow basin between two ridges, the kind of town that looked like it had been dropped there by accident and never bothered to leave. Most of the buildings leaned a little to one side, their paint long stripped by wind and weather. A few wagons creaked past on the main road, drivers hunched against the cold, and somewhere a dog barked itself hoarse. Mara kept her head down and walked. She'd heard about the Calder Ranch from a peddler 3 towns back. A big spread, he said, run by a man who kept to himself and didn't ask questions. That was all she needed. A place where nobody asked questions. The road bent north, following the curve of the ridge, and after another mile she saw it. The gate, tall and iron, with a weathered sign hanging crooked from the crossbar. Calder Ranch. Beyond it, the land stretched flat and wide, dotted with cattle and bordered by fences that looked like they'd been mended 100 times and would be mended 100 more. Mara stopped at the gate and put her hand on the cold metal. Her fingers were cracked and red, and she could feel her pulse beating thin and fast in her wrists. She pushed the gate open. It swung inward with a long, rusty groan, and before she'd taken 3 steps past it, a voice cracked across the yard like a whip. "Stop right there." Mara froze. A man stood 20 feet away, rifle already raised, his face shadowed under the brim of a wide hat. He was lean and long-limbed, dressed in range clothes that had seen better days, and he held the rifle like it was part of him. "Gate's locked for a reason," he said. "It wasn't locked," Mara said quietly. "It was just closed." The man stepped forward and she got a better look at him. Late 30s, maybe older, hard eyes, harder mouth. A scar ran from his left temple down to his jaw, pale against sun-darkened skin. "Vos Rene," he said, though she hadn't asked. "Foreman here, and you're trespassing." "I'm looking for work," Mara said. Voss snorted. "You look like you're looking for a coffin." She didn't flinch. "I can cook, I can clean, I can mend fences, haul water, milk cows, whatever needs doing. We don't need help." "Everyone needs help." Voss tilted his head, studying her the way you'd study a stray dog that wandered into camp. "Where are you from?" "East." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one you're getting." For a moment he just stared at her. Then he spat into the dirt and lowered the rifle. "Mr. Calder doesn't hire drifters, especially not women." "Then I'll ask him myself." "You won't get the chance." Voss stepped closer, close enough that she could smell tobacco and sweat and something sharper. Whiskey, maybe. "I'm telling you to leave." Mara met his eyes and didn't move. Voss's jaw tightened. He raised the rifle again, pointed it at the ground between them, and fired. The shot was deafening. Dirt exploded 6 inches from her boots, and Mara jerked back, her heart hammering so hard she thought it would crack a rib. "Next one won't miss," Voss said. Mara's hands were shaking, but she forced them still. She looked past him, toward the house. A low, sprawling structure with a wide porch and smoke curling from the chimney. Someone was inside, someone who might listen. "I'm not leaving," she said. Voss blinked. "What?" "I'm not leaving until I speak to Mr. Calder." He stared at her like she'd just grown a second head. Then he laughed, a short, sharp bark of sound that had no humor in it. "You're either the bravest woman I've ever met," he said, "or the stupidest." "Maybe both." He didn't laugh again. Instead, he levered another round into the rifle and raised it to his shoulder, sighting down the barrel at her chest. Mara didn't move. Her whole body screamed at her to run, to turn and bolt back through the gate and keep running until she couldn't run anymore. But she'd been running for months, and it hadn't gotten her anywhere except here, cold, starving, and desperate. She was done running. The moment stretched. Voss's finger rested on the trigger, and Mara could see the muscle working in his jaw. He was deciding. She could see it in his eyes. Then a voice called out from the porch. "Voss!" The foreman's head snapped around. A man stood in the doorway of the house, tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair going gray at the temples and a face that looked like it had been carved from stone. He didn't raise his voice, but the single word carried across the yard like a command. Voss lowered the rifle. "She's trespassing, Mr. Calder." The man, Grant Calder, Mara assumed, stepped off the porch and walked toward them with slow, deliberate steps. He moved like someone who didn't need to hurry, someone who knew the world would wait for him. He stopped a few feet away and looked at Mara. She looked back. His eyes were gray, the color of winter sky, and they didn't give anything away. He studied her for a long moment, her torn coat, her dirty hands, the hollowness in her cheeks, and then he said, "What do you want?" "Work," Mara said. "Food. A place to sleep." "We're not hiring." "I'll work for scraps. I'll sleep in the barn. I won't ask for wages." Grant's expression didn't change. "Why here?" "Because I ran out of road." He glanced at Voss, then back at her. "You run from the law?" "No." "Then what are you running from?" Mara hesitated. The truth sat heavy in her chest, sharp-edged and bitter, and she knew if she let it out, it would spill everywhere and she'd never get it back inside. "Myself?" she said finally. Grant's eyes flickered just for a second. Then he nodded. "Fair enough." He turned to Voss. "Put her in the bunkhouse. She can work kitchen detail for a week. If she pulls her weight, she stays. If she doesn't, she goes." Voss's face went tight. "You sure about this, boss?" "I'm sure." "She could be anyone, could be trouble." "She's one woman with a hole in her boot. I think we can handle it." Voss didn't look convinced, but he didn't argue. He just gave Mara a long, cold look and said, "Follow me." Grant walked back toward the house without another word, and Mara stood there for a moment, trying to absorb what had just happened. She'd expected to be turned away. She'd expected another bullet in the dirt, another town behind her, another night sleeping in a ditch. Instead, she had a roof, for a week at least. It wasn't much, but it was more than she'd had in a long time. The bunkhouse was a low, narrow building tucked behind the main barn, with walls that let in drafts and a door that didn't quite close all the way. Inside there were 4 bunks, rough wood frames with thin mattresses that smelled like hay and mildew, and a pot-belly stove in the corner that looked like it hadn't been lit in weeks. Voss pointed to the bunk farthest from the stove. "That one's yours. Don't touch anything that isn't. Don't go wandering, and don't get any ideas." "Ideas about what?" Mara asked. He gave her a look that could have stripped paint. "You'll figure it out." Then he left, the door banging shut behind him. Mara stood in the middle of the empty room, listening to the wind rattle the walls, and let herself breathe. She'd made it. She was inside. Now she just had to survive. The kitchen was warm, which was the first good thing Mara had felt in days. A cast-iron stove dominated one wall, its surface cluttered with pots and pans, and a long wooden table sat in the center of the room, scarred and stained from years of use. Shelves lined the opposite wall, stocked with sacks of flour, jars of preserves, and tins of coffee. Mara stood in the doorway, taking it all in, and tried to remember the last time she'd been in a real kitchen. "You the new cook?" She turned. A girl stood in the hallway, maybe 10 years old, with dark hair pulled into a messy braid and eyes that looked too old for her face. She wore a faded dress and boots that were too big, and she held herself like someone who'd learned early not to expect much from the world. "I'm Mara," Mara said, "and I'm here to help, not replace anyone." The girl shrugged. "We don't got a cook, we got Connie, but she only comes Tuesdays and Fridays. Rest of the time we make do." "You cook?" "Sometimes. Mostly I just heat things up." Mara stepped into the kitchen and set her bag on the table. "What's your name?" "Nell." "Nice to meet you, Nell." Nell didn't respond. She just stood there, watching Mara with those 2 old eyes, and Mara had the feeling she was being measured. "You got a sister?" Mara asked. Nell's expression flickered. June. She's 6. Where is she? Upstairs. She doesn't like strangers. That's okay. I don't like strangers either. Nell almost smiled. Then she turned and walked out, leaving Mara alone in the kitchen. Mara stood there for a moment, then rolled up her sleeves and got to work. She started with inventory. Flour, sugar, salt, lard, eggs in a basket by the stove, some cracked, some still whole, a smoked ham hanging from a hook in the pantry, and a sack of potatoes that had started to sprout. It wasn't much, but it was enough. By the time the sun started to set, Mara had a pot of stew simmering on the stove. Potatoes, carrots, onions, and chunks of ham in a thick, savory broth. She'd found biscuits in a tin, stale but salvageable, and she'd reheated them in the oven until they were warm and soft again. She set the table for 5. Herself, Grant, Nell, June, and Voss, and stood back to survey her work. It wasn't fancy, but it was hot, and it was filling, and it was made with care. That had to count for something. Grant came in first, his boots heavy on the floorboards. He stopped in the doorway, looked at the table, and then looked at Mara. You didn't have to do all this, he said. I know, Mara said, but I did. He nodded slowly, then sat down at the head of the table. Nell came next, with June trailing behind her, a small, wide-eyed girl with hair the same color as her sister's and a face full of freckles. June didn't say anything. She just climbed into her chair and stared at Mara like she was something dangerous. Voss came last, his expression sour. He sat at the opposite end of the table from Grant and didn't look at anyone. Mara served the stew in silence, filling bowls and setting them down with steady hands. No one spoke. No one said thank you, but they ate. And that, Mara thought, was enough. After dinner, she cleaned the kitchen while the others scattered. Grant to his office, Voss to the bunkhouse, Nell and June upstairs. The house settled into quiet, and Mara worked by lamplight, scrubbing pots and wiping down the table and sweeping the floor until it was clean. When she was done, she stepped out onto the porch and looked up at the sky. The stars were thick and bright, scattered across the black like someone had thrown a handful of salt. The wind had died down, and the air was cold but still, and for the first time in months, Mara let herself feel something close to hope. Maybe this would work. Maybe she could stay. Maybe she could stop running. She didn't see Grant again until the next morning, when she came into the kitchen before dawn to start breakfast. He was already there, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee, his face shadowed in the lamplight. You're up early, Mara said. So are you. She moved to the stove and started pulling out pans. I don't sleep much. Neither do I. They worked in silence, Mara frying eggs and bacon, Grant sipping his coffee and staring at nothing. After a while, he said, Voss doesn't like you. I noticed. He doesn't like anyone. Don't take it personal. Mara cracked another egg into the pan. Does he run things around here? He runs the ranch. I run everything else. What's everything else? Grant almost smiled. Depends on the day. Mara plated the eggs and set them in front of him, along with a thick slice of bread and a rasher of bacon. He looked at the food, then at her. You cook like this every morning? He asked. If you let me stay, I will. He picked up his fork. We'll see. The week passed in a blur of work. Mara cooked 3 meals a day, cleaned the kitchen, mended clothes, scrubbed floors, hauled water, and did a dozen other things that needed doing. She didn't complain. She didn't ask for anything. She just worked. Nell started talking to her on the 3rd day. Short, cautious conversations that didn't go anywhere but felt like progress. June still didn't say a word, but she stopped hiding when Mara came into the room, and once Mara caught her watching from the stairs while Mara braided Nell's hair. Voss stayed cold and distant, but he stopped pointing guns at her, which Mara counted as a win. And Grant watched. She could feel his eyes on her sometimes, when she was cooking or sweeping or hanging laundry in the yard. He didn't say much, but he was always there, a quiet, steady presence that she couldn't quite figure out. On the 7th day, he found her in the kitchen after dinner and said, You can stay. Mara looked up from the pot she was scrubbing. What? You've earned it. You pull your weight. The girls like you. You can stay as long as you want. Mara's hand stilled in the water. She'd been bracing herself for rejection, for another gate closing in her face, and now that it wasn't happening, she didn't know what to do. Thank you, she said quietly. Grant nodded. There's a room upstairs, used to be the housekeeper's. It's small, but it's warm. You can move your things up there tomorrow. I don't have much. Then it won't take long. He turned to leave, then stopped. One more thing. Yes? Whatever you're running from, it stays outside that gate. You understand? Mara met his eyes. I understand. He nodded again and walked out, leaving Mara alone in the kitchen with her hands in the cold, soapy water and something tight and painful lodged in her chest. She'd done it. She'd found a place to stay. Now she just had to keep it. The room upstairs was small and plain, a narrow bed, a dresser with a cracked mirror, and a window that looked out over the yard. There was a quilt on the bed, faded but clean, and a lamp on the dresser that worked when Mara lit it. It wasn't much, but it was hers. She unpacked her bag, a spare dress, a hairbrush, a small wooden box she never opened, and set them carefully on the dresser. Then she sat on the bed and looked around the room, trying to absorb the fact that she was here, that she had a roof and a bed and a door that locked. It felt strange, almost wrong. She'd spent so long moving, so long running, that staying still felt like a trap. But she was tired, so tired. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop. Nell knocked on her door that night, just after dark. Can I come in? She asked. Of course. Nell stepped inside and looked around the room, her hands tucked into the pockets of her nightgown. You staying, then? Your father said I could. He's not my father, Nell said quickly. He's my pa. There's a difference. Mara nodded. Fair enough. Nell sat on the edge of the bed, her legs swinging. The last lady who stayed here left after 2 weeks, said we were too much trouble. Who's we? Me and June. We're loud, she said, and we don't listen. Do you listen? Nell shrugged. Depends on who's talking. Mara smiled. That's fair. Nell looked at her, her expression serious. Are you going to leave too? I don't plan on it. But you might. Mara hesitated. I'll stay as long as your pa lets me. Nell didn't look convinced, but she didn't argue. She just stood up and walked to the door, then paused. June doesn't talk much, she said. But she likes you, I can tell. How? She doesn't hide when you're around. That's how you know. Then she left, the door clicking shut behind her, and Mara sat there in the quiet, staring at the lamp and trying to figure out what she'd just signed up for. The next morning, Mara was in the kitchen before dawn again, mixing biscuit dough and frying sausage, when she heard footsteps on the stairs. June appeared in the doorway, barefoot and sleepy-eyed, her hair sticking up in all directions. Morning, Mara said. June didn't respond. She just climbed into a chair at the table and watched Mara work. Mara didn't push. She just kept cooking, humming softly under her breath, and after a while June said, You make good biscuits. Mara smiled. Thank you. Better than Connie's. Don't tell Connie that. June almost smiled, then she said, Are you going to stay? Mara turned to look at her. Why does everyone keep asking me that? Because everyone leaves. Mara set down the spoon she was holding and crossed the room to sit across from June. I'm not everyone. June studied her with those big, serious eyes. You promise? I can't promise, Mara said honestly, but I'll try. June thought about that for a moment, then she nodded. Okay. And just like that, something shifted. The days turned into weeks, and Mara settled into the rhythm of the ranch. She woke before dawn, cooked breakfast, cleaned the kitchen, helped with chores, cooked lunch, cleaned again, cooked dinner, and fell into bed exhausted. It was hard work, harder than anything she'd done in a long time, but it was honest work, and it kept her hands busy and her mind quiet. Nell started seeking her out, asking questions, telling stories, showing her things she'd found in the yard. June followed her around like a shadow, silent but present, and once, she even let Mara braid her hair. Grant stayed distant but not unkind. He didn't talk much, but he noticed things, when the stove needed fixing, when the roof started leaking, when Mara ran out of flour. He didn't make a fuss, he just fixed it. Voss, on the other hand, stayed cold. He watched Mara with suspicious eyes, and more than once she caught him muttering to Grant in low, angry tones. She couldn't hear what he said, but she could guess. She didn't belong here. She was trouble. She'd bring something bad down on them. He wasn't wrong. One night, after the girls had gone to bed and the house was quiet, Mara sat on the porch and looked out at the dark horizon. The wind had picked up again, cold and sharp, and she pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders. She heard the door open behind her, and Grant stepped out, a mug of coffee in his hand. "Mind if I sit?" he asked. "It's your porch." He sat down beside her, his long legs stretched out in front of him. They didn't speak for a while, just sat there, listening to the wind and the distant sound of cattle lowing in the dark. Finally, Grant said, "Voss thinks you're hiding something." Mara's hands tightened in her lap. "Everyone's hiding something." "That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got." Grant looked at her, his gray eyes steady. "I don't need to know your whole story, but I need to know if you're putting my girls in danger." Mara turned to meet his gaze. "I'm not." "You sure about that?" "I'm sure." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "All right." He stood to leave, then paused. "For what it's worth, I think you're good for them. They've been happier these past few weeks than I've seen them in a long time." Mara's throat tightened. "Thank you." Grant nodded again and went back inside, leaving Mara alone on the porch with the wind and the dark and the weight of all the things she hadn't said. The trouble came on a Tuesday. Mara was in the yard hanging laundry when she heard hoofbeats. She looked up to see 3 riders coming up the road, their horses moving fast, dust rising behind them. She didn't recognize them, but something in the way they rode, hard and purposeful, made her stomach twist. Voss appeared from the barn, rifle already in hand. Grant came out of the house, and Nell and June crowded onto the porch behind him. The riders pulled up at the gate, and the man in front, tall, broad, with a face like old leather, leaned forward in his saddle and smiled. "Grant called her," he said. "Been a while." Grant's expression didn't change. "Rufus." The man, Rufus, let his gaze drift across the yard, taking in the house, the barn, the laundry, flapping in the wind. Then his eyes landed on Mara, and his smile widened. "Well, well," he said. "Mara Whitlock. Didn't expect to see you here." Mara's blood turned to ice. Grant's head snapped toward her. "You know him?" Mara didn't answer. She couldn't. Her whole body had gone rigid, her mind screaming at her to run, to hide, to do anything but stand there in the open, while Rufus Vale stared at her with that awful, knowing smile. "Oh, we go way back," Rufus said. "Don't we, Mara?" Mara forced herself to meet his eyes. "Get off this land." Rufus laughed. "Now that's not very friendly." Grant stepped forward, his hand resting on the revolver at his hip. "You heard her. Leave." Rufus's smile faded. "You don't even know what she is, do you? What she's done?" "I don't care." "You should." Rufus's eyes glittered. "Because the woman you've been feeding and sheltering is a liar and a thief, and she's got blood on her hands." Mara's vision blurred. Her legs felt like they were going to give out, and she had to lock her knees to stay upright. Grant's voice was low and dangerous. "I said leave." Rufus studied him for a moment, then shrugged. "Have it your way. But when the truth comes out, and it will, don't say I didn't warn you." He wheeled his horse around and rode off, his men following, and the dust settled slowly behind them. Grant turned to Mara. "Inside," he said. "Now." The office was small and crowded with papers, ledgers stacked on a desk that looked like it hadn't been cleared in years. Grant closed the door behind them, and the sound of it latching felt final, like something sealing shut. Mara stood in the center of the room, her hands clenched at her sides, and waited. Grant didn't sit. He just leaned against the desk and crossed his arms, his gray eyes hard and unreadable. "Talk," he said. Mara's throat was dry. "What do you want to know?" "Everything. Start with who he is." "Rufus Vale. He owns land east of here. Big spread, bigger than yours." "And?" "And I knew him. A long time ago." Grant's jaw tightened. "That's not enough." Mara closed her eyes. She'd known this moment would come eventually, the past catching up, dragging her back into the mud. She'd just hoped it would take longer. "I worked for him," she said finally, "on his ranch. I was a cook there, same as here." "That's it? You cooked for him?" "No." The word came out sharp, harder than she meant it to. "That's not it." Grant waited. Mara opened her eyes and looked at him. "I had a son, Tobin. He was 8 when Rufus took him." Grant's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "Took him how?" "I owed Rufus money, a lot of it." My husband died, left debts I couldn't pay, and Rufus said he'd forgive them if I worked for him. So I did. But the debts never got smaller. They just kept growing, and when I couldn't pay anymore, he took Tobin as collateral. Collateral, Grant repeated, his voice flat. That's what he called it. Said the boy would work off what I owed. Said I'd get him back when the debt was clear. Did you? Mara's hands trembled. No, I tried. I worked myself half to death trying to pay it off, but Rufus kept adding to it. Room and board, interest, fees I'd never heard of. It was a trap, and I was stupid enough to walk into it. So you ran. So I ran. Mara's voice cracked. I left my son with that man, and I ran because I didn't know what else to do. Grant stared at her for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then he said, How long ago? 2 years. And you haven't seen your boy since? Mara shook her head. She didn't trust herself to speak. Grant pushed off the desk and walked to the window, looking out at the yard. Rufus called you a liar and a thief. Was he lying? No. Grant turned. Which part? I stole from him. Food, mostly. A little money. I was trying to save enough to buy Tobin out, but Rufus caught me. That's when I ran. And the blood on your hands? Mara hesitated. I don't know what he meant by that. You sure? I'm sure. Grant studied her, and Mara forced herself to hold his gaze. She'd told him the truth, most of it anyway, and now it was up to him to decide what to do with it. Finally, he said, You should have told me this before. I know. Voss was right. You are trouble. I know. Grant rubbed a hand over his face, suddenly looking older and more tired than Mara had ever seen him. I've got 2 girls upstairs who've already lost their mother. I can't have them losing someone else. I'm not going anywhere, Mara said. You might not have a choice. If Rufus comes back, then I'll deal with him. How? Mara didn't have an answer for that. Grant sighed. Get back to work. We'll talk about this later. Grant? Later? He walked past her and out the door, leaving Mara standing alone in the crowded office with her heart hammering and her hands still shaking. She'd told him, and he hadn't thrown her out, but she could see it in his eyes, the doubt, the worry, the calculation of risk. He was wondering if she was worth the trouble, and Mara didn't blame him, because she was wondering the same thing. The rest of the day passed in a haze. Mara cooked lunch, cleaned the kitchen, and avoided everyone's eyes. Nell asked her twice if she was okay, and both times Mara lied and said she was fine. June didn't ask anything, but she stayed close, trailing Mara from room to room like she was afraid Mara might disappear if she looked away. Voss didn't say a word, but Mara could feel his smugness radiating across the yard like heat from a fire. He'd been right about her, and now everyone knew it. That night, after the girls had gone to bed, Mara sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea she wasn't drinking and stared at the lamp flame until her eyes burned. She heard footsteps behind her and didn't turn around. You gonna sit there all night? Grant asked. Maybe. He pulled out a chair and sat across from her. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then he said, Rufus Vale is a bad man. I know. Worse than you probably think. He's got half the county in his pocket. Sheriff, judge, land office. If he wants something, he takes it, and nobody stops him. Mara looked up. Are you telling me to leave? I'm telling you what you're up against. I already know what I'm up against. Grant leaned back in his chair. Your boy, Tobin, you think he's still with Rufus? I don't know. I've tried to find out, but nobody will talk to me. Rufus made sure of that. And if he is still there? Mara's jaw tightened. Then I'll get him back. How? I don't know yet. Grant shook his head. You can't go up against Rufus alone. He'll crush you. Then what am I supposed to do? Just leave him there? I didn't say that. Mara's hands clenched around the cup. I'm not asking for your help, Grant. I'm not asking for anything. I just need you to let me stay long enough to figure this out. Grant studied her for a long moment. Then he said, The girls like you. I like them too. They've been through a lot. Their mother left when June was 2. Just walked out one day and never came back. Since then, we've had 3 housekeepers, and every single one of them quit or ran off with some drifter passing through. Nell and June learned pretty quick not to get attached. Mara's chest tightened. I'm not leaving. You keep saying that. Because it's true. Grant sighed. I want to believe you. Then believe me. He stood up, pushing his chair back. Get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. Grant. He paused at the doorway. Thank you, Mara said, for not throwing me out. Grant looked back at her, his expression unreadable. Don't make me regret it. Then he was gone, and Mara was alone again with the lamp and the silence and the weight of everything she hadn't said. The next morning, Mara woke before dawn and went straight to the kitchen. She needed to work, needed to keep her hands busy and her mind from spiraling. She made biscuits and gravy, fried eggs and bacon, and brewed a pot of coffee strong enough to strip paint. Nell came down first, rubbing sleep from her eyes. You okay? She asked. Fine, Mara said, not looking up from the stove. You don't look fine. Well, I am. Nell sat at the table and watched her for a moment. Then she said, Who was that man yesterday? The one on the horse? Mara's hand stilled. Nobody important. He knew your name. Lots of people know my name. But you looked scared. Mara turned to face her. I wasn't scared. Nell tilted her head, her dark eyes sharp. You're lying. Nell, I don't care if you're scared, Nell said. I just want you to tell me the truth. Mara set down the spatula and crossed to the table. She sat down across from Nell and looked at her, really looked at her, and saw a girl who'd learned too young that adults couldn't be trusted. You're right, Mara said. I was scared. That man is someone I used to know, and he's not a good person. Is he going to hurt you? I don't know. Is he going to make you leave? Mara reached across the table and took Nell's hand. I'm not leaving. No matter what he does, I'm not leaving. Nell's fingers tightened around hers. You promise? I promise. Nell didn't look entirely convinced, but she nodded. Then she said, If he comes back, I'll shoot him. Mara blinked. What? I know where Pa keeps the rifle. I'll shoot him if he tries to take you. Nell, you're not shooting anyone. Why not? Boss does it all the time. That's different. How? Mara didn't have a good answer for that. Instead, she said, Let me handle it, okay? You just worry about being 10. Nell pulled her hand back and crossed her arms. I'm not a baby. I know, but you're also not a vigilante. Nell almost smiled. Then June appeared in the doorway, barefoot and sleepy, and climbed into the chair next to her sister. Morning, Junebug, Mara said. June didn't respond, but she leaned her head against Nell's shoulder, and Nell wrapped an arm around her without thinking. Mara's chest ached, watching them. They were so small, so fragile, and they'd already been through so much. She couldn't let them down. She wouldn't. Breakfast was quiet. Grant ate quickly and left without a word, and Voss didn't come in at all. Nell and June picked at their food, and Mara forced herself to eat even though she wasn't hungry. After the dishes were done, Mara went outside to hang laundry. The sky was gray and heavy, threatening rain, and the wind whipped the wet sheets around her face as she worked. She was pinning up the last shirt when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to find Voss standing a few feet away, arms crossed, his expression as cold as ever. What do you want? Mara asked. To tell you I was right. Congratulations. You want a medal? Voss's jaw tightened. You need to leave. Grant said I could stay. Grant's got a soft spot for strays. Doesn't mean you belong here. Mara turned back to the laundry. I'm not going anywhere. You will when Rufus comes back, and he will come back. Then I'll deal with him. Voss stepped closer. You don't get it, do you? Rufus Vale doesn't just ruin people. He destroys them, and everyone around them. You stay here. You're putting this whole ranch at risk. Mara spun around, her hands clenched. You think I don't know that? You think I wanted this? I came here because I had nowhere else to go, and I stayed because Grant let me. I'm doing the best I can. Your best isn't good enough. The words hit like a slap. Mara's vision blurred, and she had to look away before Voss saw the tears. I'm not leaving, she said again, quieter this time. Voss stared at her for a long moment. Then he said, You're a fool. He walked away, and Mara stood there in the yard with the wind pulling at her hair and the laundry snapping on the line. He was right. She was a fool, but she was a fool who'd made a promise, and she wasn't going to break it. The rain started that afternoon, a steady, cold drizzle that turned the yard to mud and drummed on the roof like fingers tapping. Mara spent the day inside, cooking, cleaning, and trying to ignore the knot of dread that had settled in her stomach. Nell and June stayed close, playing quiet games in the corner of the kitchen while Mara worked. Every so often, Nell would look up and ask a question about cooking, about the weather, about nothing in particular, and Mara would answer, grateful for the distraction. At one point, June tugged on Mara's sleeve and held up a small wooden doll. "This is Annie," she said. It was the first full sentence June had spoken to her. Mara knelt down to her level. "She's very pretty." "She's sad," June said. "Her mama left." Mara's throat tightened. "Did she?" June nodded. "But now she has a new mama. She's not sad anymore." Mara glanced at Nell, who was watching them with wide, careful eyes. "That's good," Mara said softly. "Everyone deserves a mama who stays." June hugged the doll to her chest and went back to playing, and Mara stood up, blinking hard. That night, after the girls were in bed, Grant found Mara in the kitchen again. "You've got to stop sitting here in the dark," he said. "I'm not in the dark. The lamp's on." "Barely." He lit another lamp and set it on the table, filling the room with warm golden light. Then he sat down across from her and said, "I've been thinking." "About what?" "About Rufus, about your boy." Mara looked up. "And?" "And I think we should go talk to him." Mara blinked. "What?" "Not to fight, just to talk. See if we can work something out." "There's nothing to work out. Rufus doesn't negotiate." "Maybe not, but it's worth a try." "Grant, you don't understand." "I understand plenty. I understand you've got a son you haven't seen in 2 years, and I understand Rufus Vale is the kind of man who'd use that against you. But I also understand that running and hiding isn't going to solve anything." Mara stared at him. "Why are you doing this?" "Because Nell asked me to." "What?" Grant's mouth twitched, almost a smile. "She came to me this morning, said if I let you leave, she'd never forgive me. Said you're the first person who stayed, and if I ran you off, I was no better than her mother." Mara's eyes burned. "She said that? She's got a temper, that one. Gets it from me." Mara laughed, a shaky, breathless sound. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll let me help." Mara hesitated. She'd spent so long doing everything alone, carrying every burden by herself, that the idea of accepting help felt foreign and uncomfortable. But she was tired. So tired. "Okay," she said finally. "Okay." Grant nodded. "We'll leave in the morning." They rode out at first light, the rain from the day before leaving the ground soft and the air cold. Grant rode a tall bay gelding, and Mara rode a smaller chestnut mare that Grant said was gentle and steady. Mara hadn't been on a horse in years, and her legs ached within the first mile, but she didn't complain. She just gritted her teeth and kept going. They didn't talk much. Grant wasn't a talker, and Mara didn't have anything to say. They just rode side by side through the wide, empty country. After 2 hours, they crested a ridge, and Mara saw it. The Vale Ranch, sprawling and grand, with a big house that looked more like a mansion and barns that could have held 100 head of cattle. It made the Calder Ranch look small by comparison. Grant pulled his horse to a stop. "You sure about this?" Mara nodded. "I'm sure." They rode down the ridge and up to the gate. A man was waiting there, one of the riders from the other day, and he looked them over with cold, calculating eyes. "Mr. Vale's expecting you," he said. Grant frowned. "How'd he know we were coming?" The man smiled. "Mr. Vale knows everything." He opened the gate, and they rode through. The house was even bigger up close, all white columns and polished wood and windows that gleamed in the pale morning light. Rufus stood on the front porch, hands in his pockets, looking like a king surveying his kingdom. "Grant Calder," he said. "Didn't think you'd actually show up." "We're here to talk," Grant said. "Are you now?" Rufus's eyes slid to Mara. "And you brought the lady. How gallant." Mara dismounted and walked toward the porch, her legs shaking but her spine straight. "Where's my son?" Rufus smiled. "Straight to the point. I like that." "Answer the question." "He's here, safe and sound." "I want to see him." "I'm sure you do, but that's not how this works." Grant stepped forward. "What do you want, Rufus?" Rufus tilted his head, considering. "What do I want? That's a good question. I want a lot of things, Grant. I want this land. I want that water rights deal you've been sitting on. I want—" Cut the bullshit, Grant said. What do you want for the boy? Rufus's smile widened. The boy's not for sale. Mara's heart dropped. What? He's mine, fair and square. His mother signed a contract, and that contract's still in effect. That contract was a trap, Mara said, her voice shaking. You know it was. Maybe, but it's legal, and unless you can pay what you owe, which I'm guessing you can't, the boy stays here. Grant's hand moved to his holster, but Rufus just laughed. You gonna shoot me, Grant? In front of all my men? That'd be a hell of a story. Grant's jaw tightened, but he didn't draw. Rufus turned back to Mara. Here's the deal. You leave Calder's ranch, come work for me again, and I'll let you see the boy. Maybe even let him go, if you work hard enough. No, Grant said. Rufus raised an eyebrow. That's not your decision. Yes, it is. She works for me now. Not for long, she won't. Not when the whole town knows what she is. Mara's stomach twisted. What are you talking about? Rufus pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket and handed it to her. Read it yourself. Mara unfolded the paper with trembling hands. It was a notice, printed in bold letters, announcing that Mara Whitlock was wanted for theft and fraud, and that anyone harboring her would be held accountable. That's a lie, Mara said. Is it? You stole from me. You admitted it yourself. I took food to feed my son. Theft is theft, sweetheart. Grant snatched the paper from Mara's hands and crumpled it. This won't hold up. Maybe not, but it'll make people talk. And once people start talking, they start asking questions. Questions about who Mara really is, what she's done, why she ran. Rufus's eyes glittered. How long do you think it'll take before your nice little ranch becomes the center of a scandal? Grant stared at him, his face hard as stone. Rufus smiled. You've got 3 days. After that, I'm taking this to the sheriff, and we'll see how charitable folks feel about harboring a criminal. He turned and walked back into the house, and the door slammed shut behind him. Mara stood there, her whole body numb, and felt the world collapse around her. The ride back was silent. Mara's mind was spinning, and she could barely keep herself upright in the saddle. Grant didn't say a word, just rode with his jaw set and his eyes fixed on the horizon. When they got back to the ranch, Voss was waiting in the yard. Well, he said. Grant dismounted and handed him the reins. It went about as well as you'd expect. Voss looked at Mara. You satisfied now? Mara didn't answer. She just slid off her horse and walked toward the house, her legs like lead. Inside, Nell and June were sitting at the kitchen table drawing pictures. They looked up when Mara came in, and Nell's face fell. What happened? She asked. Nothing, Mara said. Everything's fine. You're lying again. Mara sank into a chair and put her head in her hands. She was so tired. So tired of lying, of running, of trying to hold everything together when it kept falling apart. June climbed out of her chair and walked over to Mara. She didn't say anything. She just put her small hand on Mara's arm and stood there. And somehow, that was enough. That night, Mara couldn't sleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling and trying to figure out what to do. She could leave, pack her things, and disappear before Rufus made good on his threat. It would be easier that way, cleaner. But then she thought about Nell's fierce little face, and June's quiet hand on her arm, and Grant's steady, unreadable eyes. She'd promised them she wouldn't leave, and she meant it. So she got up, pulled on her coat, and went downstairs. Grant was in the kitchen, sitting at the table with a bottle of whiskey and an empty glass. Can't sleep either? He asked. Mara sat down across from him. I'm sorry. For what? For bringing this down on you. Voss was right. I'm trouble. Grant poured himself a drink and downed it in one swallow. Voss is always right. Doesn't mean I have to listen to him. You should. Maybe. Grant poured another drink. But I won't. Mara looked at him. Why? Because my girls need you, and because I'm tired of letting men like Rufus Vale run roughshod over everyone. He pushed the bottle toward her. Mara hesitated, then poured herself a small glass. What are we going to do? She asked. Grant leaned back in his chair. We're going to fight. Mara woke to the smell of smoke. For a moment, she thought she was dreaming, caught in some half-remembered nightmare from years ago. But then she heard shouting, and the acrid burn in her throat was too real, too sharp. She threw off the blankets and ran to the window. Orange light flickered across the yard, and when she looked toward the barn, her heart stopped. Fire. The whole east side was engulfed, flames licking up the wooden walls and spreading fast. Mara grabbed her coat and ran downstairs, her bare feet slapping against the cold floorboards. Grant was already outside, shouting orders to Voss and the ranch hands who'd come running from the bunkhouse. They'd formed a bucket line from the well, passing water hand to hand, but the fire was moving faster than they could contain it. "Get the horses out," Grant yelled, and 2 men ran toward the barn doors. Mara ran after them. The heat hit her like a wall, and smoke poured from the open doors in thick, choking clouds. Inside, horses screamed and kicked at their stalls, eyes rolling white with terror. One of the hands was trying to open the stalls, but his hands were shaking so badly he couldn't work the latches. Mara pushed past him and yanked the first door open. A gray mare bolted out, nearly trampling her, and Mara moved to the next stall, then the next. The smoke was so thick she could barely see. Her eyes streamed and her lungs burned, but she kept moving, kept pulling doors open and slapping horses on the rump to send them running into the night. She'd just opened the last stall when a beam overhead cracked with a sound like a gunshot. She looked up and saw it falling, saw the flames racing along its length, and knew she didn't have time to move. Then someone grabbed her arm and yanked her backward. She stumbled and fell, hitting the ground hard, and the beam crashed down right where she'd been standing, sending up a shower of sparks. Grant hauled her to her feet. "What the hell are you doing?" "The horses are out. Now get out of here before the whole thing comes down." He shoved her toward the door, and they stumbled out into the cold night air. Mara doubled over, coughing so hard she thought her ribs would crack, and Grant slapped her on the back until she could breathe again. By the time the fire finally died, the barn was gone. Just a smoking skeleton of charred beams and ash, glowing red in the pre-dawn darkness. The horses had scattered across the property, and it would take days to round them all up. 3 calves had been trapped in a pen near the barn and hadn't made it out. Grant stood in the middle of the wreckage, his face black with soot, and stared at the ruin. Voss walked over, his expression grim. It was set. Grant didn't look at him. "You sure?" "Found kerosene cans on the south side. Whoever did this wanted it to burn fast." Grant's jaw tightened. "Rufus. Has to be." Mara felt the words like a punch to the gut. This was her fault. Rufus had done this because of her, because she'd refused to leave, because she'd brought her mess into Grant's life, and now everything was burning. She turned and walked back toward the house, her legs shaking, her mind blank. Inside, Nell and June were huddled together on the stairs, their faces pale and frightened. When they saw Mara, they both ran to her. "Are you okay?" Nell asked, her voice high and tight. "I'm fine," Mara said, though she wasn't. Nothing was fine. June clung to her waist, trembling, and Mara put her arms around both of them and held on. "Is the barn gone?" Nell whispered. "Yes." "Did anyone get hurt?" "No, everyone's safe." Nell pulled back and looked at her. "This is because of that man, isn't it? The one who came here?" Mara didn't answer. "It is," Nell said, her voice hard. "He did this because of you." "Nell, I don't care," Nell said fiercely. "I don't care what he does. You're not leaving." Mara's throat closed up. She wanted to tell Nell that she was wrong, that sometimes leaving was the only way to keep people safe, but the words wouldn't come. Grant came in a few minutes later, his face drawn and exhausted. He looked at the girls, then at Mara. "Get them back to bed," he said quietly. "We'll deal with the rest in the morning." Mara nodded and led Nell and June upstairs. She tucked them in, even though Nell protested that she was too old for tucking in, and sat on the edge of June's bed until both girls finally fell asleep. Then she went back downstairs and found Grant in the kitchen, pouring himself another whiskey. "I'm leaving," Mara said. Grant looked up. "No, you're not." "Grant, he burned your barn. What's next? The house? What if the girls had been in there?" "They weren't." "But they could have been," Mara's voice cracked. "Don't you see? As long as I'm here, you're all in danger." Grant set down the glass and walked over to her. "You think running will stop him? You think Rufus will just let you go?" "I don't know, but I can't stay here and watch him destroy everything you've built." "Then don't watch. Help me fight back." Mara stared at him. "How? He owns the sheriff. He owns the judge. He owns half the damn county. What are we supposed to do?" "We make him pay," Grant said, "one way or another." His eyes were hard. determined, and Mara realized he wasn't going to let this go. He was going to fight Rufus, with or without her, and if she ran now, she'd be abandoning him the same way everyone else had. "Okay," she said quietly. "Okay, what do we do?" Grant picked up his glass again. "First, we sleep. Then we figure out how to hit him where it hurts." The next morning, the whole town knew about the fire. Word spread fast in Ashridge Hollow, and by noon, half the ranchers in the area had stopped by to offer help, rebuilding supplies, extra hands, whatever Grant needed. But there were others who came too. Men who looked at Mara with suspicious eyes and whispered to Grant when they thought she couldn't hear. One of them was Tom Brennan, a thick-shouldered rancher with a bushy gray beard. He pulled Grant aside while Mara was serving coffee on the porch. "Heard Rufus Vale's been stirring up trouble," Brennan said. "That's one way to put it," Grant said. "Also heard it's got something to do with your new cook." Grant's expression didn't change. "You heard wrong." "Did I?" Brennan glanced at Mara. "Because Rufus is telling anyone who'll listen that she's a thief and a liar, says she owes him money and ran out on her debts." "Rufus says a lot of things." "So it's not true?" Grant crossed his arms. "What's your point, Tom?" Brennan lowered his voice. "My point is, you got two girls to think about. And if this woman is bringing trouble to your door, maybe it's time to cut her loose." Grant's eyes went cold. "Get off my land." Brennan blinked. "What?" "You heard me. Get off my land before I throw you off." Brennan's face reddened. "I'm trying to help you, Grant. I don't need your help, and I don't need your advice. Now get." Brennan stared at him for a long moment, then turned and walked back to his horse, muttering under his breath. Mara had heard the whole exchange. She set down the coffee pot and went inside, her hands shaking. She found Voss in the hall, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. "You should leave," he said flatly. "I know." "Then why are you still here?" Mara looked at him. "Because Grant asked me to stay." Voss shook his head. "He's going to lose everything because of you. The ranch, his reputation, maybe even his girls. And for what? So you can play house and pretend you're something you're not?" Mara's chest tightened. "What do you want me to say?" "I want you to admit that you're poison, that everyone you touch ends up worse off." The words hit like a slap. Mara opened her mouth to argue, but nothing came out, because deep down, she was afraid he was right. Voss pushed off the wall and walked past her. "You got 2 days before Rufus makes his next move. If you're smart, you'll be gone by then." That afternoon, a rider came from town with a message for Grant. Mara watched from the kitchen window as Grant read it, his face going hard. When he came inside, he handed her the paper without a word. It was a summons. Rufus had filed a formal complaint with the sheriff, accusing Mara of theft and breach of contract. There would be a hearing in 3 days, and if she didn't show up, a warrant would be issued for her arrest. "He's forcing your hand," Grant said. "Either you run or you face him in court." Mara's hands trembled. "I can't win in court. He owns the judge." "Maybe, but if you run, you lose by default, and he'll use that to come after you and anyone who helped you." Mara sank into a chair. "So I'm trapped?" "Not yet." Grant sat across from her. "There's one thing Rufus can't control." "What's that?" "The truth. If you stand up in front of the whole town and tell your story, really tell it, some people will listen. And if enough people listen, Rufus loses his power." Mara shook her head. "You don't know these people. They'll believe whatever Rufus tells them. Some will, but not all. And all we need is enough to make him think twice." "And if it doesn't work?" Grant's expression was grim. "Then we fight, for real." That night, Mara couldn't eat. She sat at the dinner table and pushed food around her plate while Nell and June chattered about their day. Grant watched her from across the table, his eyes steady and calm, and Mara wondered how he could be so sure when everything felt like it was falling apart. After the girls went to bed, Mara walked out onto the porch and stared at the blackened remains of the barn. The smell of smoke still hung in the air, sharp and bitter. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Nell standing in the doorway, wrapped in a blanket. "You're not sleeping either?" Nell asked. "Can't seem to." Nell came and sat on the steps beside her. "Are you scared?" "Yes." "Me too." They sat in silence for a while. Then Nell said, My mama left because she was scared. She didn't say it, but I knew. She was scared of being stuck here forever, scared of being poor, scared of being nobody. So she left. Mara's throat tightened. I'm sorry. Don't be. I'm not. Nell pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. I used to think I hated her for leaving, but now I think maybe she just wasn't strong enough to stay. She looked at Mara. You're strong enough, I know you are. Mara's eyes burned. What if I'm not? Then we'll help you, Nell said simply. That's what families do. And just like that, something inside Mara broke open. She pulled Nell into a hug and held her tight, and Nell wrapped her skinny arms around Mara's neck and didn't let go. When they finally pulled apart, Nell said, You're going to that hearing, right? Yes. And you're going to tell the truth? Yes. Good. Nell stood up and brushed off her nightgown. Because if you don't, I'll drag you there myself. She went back inside, and Mara sat on the porch alone, staring at the stars and trying to find the courage Nell seemed so sure she had. The day before the hearing, Rufus came back. This time, he didn't come alone. He brought a dozen men, hard-looking types with guns on their hips and mean eyes. They rode right up to the gate and stopped, and Rufus sat tall in his saddle, looking like a general surveying a battlefield. Grant met him at the gate, rifle in hand. Voss stood beside him, and Mara stayed on the porch with Nell and June behind her. What do you want, Rufus? Grant called. Just came to deliver a message, Rufus said, in case Mara here didn't get the summons. She got it. Good. Then she knows she's expected in town tomorrow, 10 o'clock sharp. She'll be there. Rufus smiled. Will she? Because I've been hearing rumors that she might run. Wouldn't be the first time. Mara stepped forward, her heart pounding. I'm not running. Rufus's smile widened. Well, well, the lady speaks. Tell me, Mara, you gonna stand up in front of the whole town and lie about me? Say I forced you into that contract? Say I stole your boy? I'm gonna tell the truth. The truth? Rufus laughed. That's rich. You wouldn't know the truth if it bit you. I know you're a liar and a cheat, Mara said, her voice shaking but steady. And I know you took my son and used him to keep me trapped. That's the truth. Rufus's expression went cold. Careful, sweetheart. You keep talking like that, you might find yourself in a world of hurt. Is that a threat? Grant asked. Just a friendly warning. Rufus's eyes flicked to the burned barn. Accidents happen, especially to people who don't know when to shut their mouths. Grant raised the rifle. Get off my land! Rufus didn't move. One more thing. After tomorrow, when Mara's locked up and you're left holding the pieces, ask yourself if it was worth it. If one broken woman was worth losing everything. He turned his horse and rode off, his men following, and the dust settled slowly behind them. Grant lowered the rifle, his knuckles white around the stock. He's not going to stop, Voss said quietly. I know. And tomorrow's not going to go the way you think it will. I know that too. Voss shook his head. You're a damn fool, Grant. Yeah, probably. That night, Mara barely slept. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, running through everything she would say, every word she'd have to defend. She knew Rufus would twist it all, make her look like the villain, but she had to try. She had to. Just before dawn, she got up and dressed in the one decent dress she owned. Plain brown cotton, a little worn, but clean. She braided her hair and pinned it up, then looked at herself in the cracked mirror. She looked small, fragile, like someone who could be blown away by the first strong wind. But she wasn't. Not anymore. There was a soft knock on her door, and when she opened it, she found June standing there in her nightgown, holding her wooden doll. I want you to take Annie, June said. What? For luck. She helps me when I'm scared. Mara knelt down and took the doll, her eyes stinging. Thank you, Junebug. June threw her arms around Mara's neck and whispered, Come back, okay? I will, Mara promised. I will. The ride into town was quiet. Grant drove the wagon, and Mara sat beside him, clutching June's doll in her lap. Voss had stayed behind to watch the ranch and the girls, though Mara suspected he was just avoiding the spectacle. When they reached Ashridge Hollow, the main street was already crowded. Word had spread, and it seemed like half the county had come to watch. Mara's stomach twisted. She'd known people would show up, But seeing them all gathered there, staring, whispering, made it real in a way that terrified her. Grant helped her down from the wagon, his hand steady on her arm. "You don't have to do this." "Yes, I do." He nodded. "Then let's go." The hearing was held in the town hall, a drafty building with warped floors and windows that rattled in the wind. Inside, chairs had been set up in rows, and they were already filling with people. Ranchers, shopkeepers, farmers, all craning their necks to get a look at Mara. At the front of the room sat Judge Harlan Briggs, a gray-haired man with small, mean eyes and a face like a bulldog. He was one of Rufus's men. Everyone knew it, but nobody said it out loud. Rufus sat at a table on the right side of the room, looking calm and confident, flanked by a well-dressed lawyer who'd clearly come from somewhere bigger than Ashridge Hollow. Mara sat at a table on the left with Grant beside her. They didn't have a lawyer. They didn't have anything except the truth. Judge Briggs banged his gavel, and the room fell silent. "This hearing is now in session," he said. "Mr. Vale, you may present your case." Rufus's lawyer stood up, smoothing his jacket. "Your Honor, this is a simple matter of contract law. Mrs. Whitlock entered into a binding agreement with Mr. Vale, promising to work off a debt owed by her late husband. She failed to fulfill that agreement and fled, taking property that did not belong to her." "What property?" Grant asked, standing up. The lawyer gave him a condescending smile. "Food supplies, linens, a sum of cash. The total value amounts to over $300. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "That's a lie," Mara said, her voice shaking. Judge Briggs banged his gavel. "You'll have your turn to speak, Mrs. Whitlock. Sit down." Mara sat, her hands clenched in her lap. The lawyer continued, laying out Rufus's version of events, how Mara had come to him begging for help, how he generously offered her work and shelter, how she'd repaid him with theft and betrayal. It was all lies, but it was lies told smoothly, confidently, by a man in an expensive suit, and Mara could see people believing it. When the lawyer finally sat down, Judge Briggs turned to Mara. "You may respond." Mara stood up, her legs shaking. She looked out at the crowd, all those faces, all those eyes, and felt her courage waver. Then she saw Grant, steady and calm beside her, and she thought of Nell and June waiting for her at the ranch. She took a breath and began. "Everything Mr. Vale's lawyer just said is a lie," she said. "I did work for Rufus Vale, and I did owe him money, but that contract wasn't fair. It was a trap. He kept adding charges, room, board, fees I'd never heard of, until the debt was so big I could never pay it. And when I tried to leave, he took my son." The crowd erupted. People shouted, gasped, turned to each other in shock. Judge Briggs banged his gavel. "Order! Order!" "My son's name is Tobin," Mara continued, raising her voice over the noise. "He's 10 years old, and Rufus Vale has kept him on his ranch for 2 years, using him as collateral to keep me trapped." "That's the truth." Rufus stood up, his face red. "That's slander." "It's the truth," Mara shot back. Judge Briggs banged his gavel again. "Mrs. Whitlock, do you have any proof of these claims?" Mara's heart sank. "No, but then this hearing is over. Without evidence, your accusations are nothing but hearsay." "Wait," Grant said, standing up. "There are witnesses, people who worked at Vale's ranch. They can testify." "Can they?" Judge Briggs looked skeptical. "And where are these witnesses?" Grant hesitated. He didn't have an answer. Rufus smiled. "Face it, Calder. You've got nothing." The room buzzed with conversation, and Mara felt the walls closing in. She'd failed. She'd stood up and told the truth, and it hadn't mattered. Then the door at the back of the room banged open. Everyone turned. A boy stood in the doorway, thin, dirty, with dark hair and eyes that burned with something fierce and unbreakable. Mara's breath caught. "Tobin?" she whispered. The boy looked at her and his face crumpled. "Mama?" And then he was running, shoving through the crowd, and Mara was running too. And when they met in the middle of the aisle, she dropped to her knees and pulled him into her arms. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think, could only hold him and feel his thin shoulders shaking under her hands. "I thought I'd lost you," she whispered. I ran," Tobin said, his voice muffled against her shoulder. "I heard you were here and I ran. I'm sorry, Mama. I'm so sorry." "Don't be sorry," Mara said fiercely. "Don't ever be sorry." Rufus was on his feet, his face twisted with rage. "That boy is my property!" "He's a child," Grant roared. "Not property." Judge Briggs banged his gavel, but nobody was listening anymore. The whole room had erupted into chaos, people shouting, arguing, some rushing forward to get a better look. And in the middle of it all, Mara held her son and knew that whatever happened next, she wasn't letting go. Judge Briggs's gavel cracked against the desk like a gunshot, over and over, but the noise in the room only grew louder. People were standing, pushing forward, shouting questions and accusations. Rufus was yelling something about theft and kidnapping, his face purple with rage, while his lawyer tried and failed to restore order. Mara didn't care about any of it. She kept her arms wrapped around Tobin, feeling the sharp angles of his shoulders, the way his ribs pressed against her through his thin shirt. He was too skinny, too small for 10 years old, and rage flooded through her, hot and pure and clean. "Mrs. Whitlock, release that boy immediately," Judge Briggs barked. Mara looked up at him, her eyes burning. "No. That's contempt of court." "I don't care." Grant stepped between them, his hand up. "Judge, the boy just ran 10 miles to get here. Let him catch his breath before you start throwing charges around." "Mr. Calder, you are dangerously close to joining Mrs. Whitlock in contempt." "Then hold me in contempt," Grant said evenly. "But that boy stays with his mother." Rufus shoved his lawyer aside and pointed at Tobin. "That boy is bound to me by legal contract. He works my land until his mother's debt is paid. That's the law." "The law doesn't allow slavery," someone shouted from the crowd. "It's not slavery, it's restitution." "Sounds like slavery to me." The room erupted again, and Judge Briggs looked like he was about to have a stroke. His face had gone red, and his gavel hand trembled as he hammered the desk. "Enough! Everyone sit down, or I'll have the sheriff clear this room." The crowd settled, reluctantly, but the tension hung thick in the air. Mara helped Tobin to his feet, keeping one arm around him. He leaned into her side, his body shaking, and she could feel how exhausted he was. Judge Briggs pointed at Tobin. "Boy, come forward." Tobin pressed closer to Mara. "It's okay," Mara whispered. "I'm right here." Tobin took a shaky breath and stepped forward, though Mara kept her hand on his shoulder. Up close, she could see the dirt ground into his clothes, the bruises on his arms, the way he favored his left leg. "State your name," Judge Briggs said. "Tobin Whitlock." "And where have you been living?" Tobin's jaw tightened. "Vale Ranch." "Under what arrangement?" "I work there, in the stables, sometimes in the fields." "And did you run away?" Tobin glanced at Rufus, then back at the judge. "Yes, sir." "Why?" "Because I heard my mama was in trouble, and because I was tired of being treated like a piece of property." Murmurs rippled through the crowd again. Judge Briggs's expression didn't change, but Mara saw something flicker in his eyes. Uncertainty, maybe, or doubt. "Mr. Vale," the judge said, "do you dispute that this boy has been living on your ranch?" Rufus's lawyer stood up quickly. "My client does not dispute that fact. However, the boy was placed in Mr. Vale's care as part of a legal agreement." "An agreement I never signed," Mara interrupted. The lawyer gave her a cold look. "The agreement was with your late husband, who incurred significant debts before his death. Those debts passed to you as his widow, and when you proved unable to pay, you agreed to work them off. The boy was collateral." "I never agreed to that." "You signed the contract, because Rufus told me it was the only way to keep a roof over our heads. He said if I didn't sign, we'd starve." The lawyer smiled thinly. "Duress is not a legal defense for breach of contract." Grant stepped forward. "Show us the contract." The lawyer blinked. "Excuse me?" "The contract. You keep talking about it. Let's see it." The lawyer exchanged a look with Rufus, who gave a barely perceptible nod. The lawyer opened his briefcase and pulled out a sheaf of papers, handing them to Judge Briggs. The judge scanned the pages, his expression unreadable. Then he looked at Mara. "This appears to be signed by you." "Let me see it," Mara said. Judge Briggs hesitated, then handed her the papers. Mara's hand shook as she read. The contract was dense, written in legal language she barely understood, but the signature at the bottom was definitely hers. She remembered signing it, Rufus standing over her, telling her to hurry up, that it was just a formality. She hadn't read it. She'd been too desperate, too scared. But as she scanned the pages now, one section jumped out at her. A clause near the bottom, in smaller print than the rest. "This says the debt accrues interest at 20% per month," she said slowly. "That's standard," the lawyer said. 20% a month? That's not standard, that's robbery. "It's what you agreed to." Mara looked at Grant, her eyes wide. "I didn't know, I swear, I didn't know." Grant took the contract from her and read it, his face going hard. Then he looked at Judge Briggs. "This contract is predatory. No reasonable person would agree to these terms if they understood them." "Mrs. Whitlock's understanding is not relevant," the lawyer said smoothly. "She signed. That makes it binding." "Not if she was coerced," Grant shot back. "There's no evidence of coercion." "The hell there isn't," Mara's voice rang out across the room. "Rufus told me if I didn't sign, he'd have me thrown off his land. My husband had just died. I had a child to feed, and he knew I was desperate. He used that against me." Rufus stood up, his voice cold. "I offered you a way out of poverty. You took it. That's not coercion. That's charity." "Charity?" Mara laughed bitterly. "You worked me 14 hours a day, paid me nothing, and when I couldn't keep up with your impossible terms, you took my son. That's not charity. That's cruelty." The room was silent now, everyone hanging on every word. Rufus's expression didn't change. "You stole from me. That's a fact. You took food, supplies, cash, to feed my son." Mara's voice cracked. "He was hungry, Rufus. He was a child, and he was hungry, and you wouldn't give him enough to eat. So yes, I took food. I'd do it again. Theft is theft." "And slavery is slavery," Grant said quietly. "Doesn't matter what fancy words you dress it up in." Rufus turned on him, his eyes blazing. "You want to talk about slavery, Calder? Let's talk about how you're harboring a criminal on your ranch. How you've been protecting her, feeding her, giving her shelter, all while knowing she's a fugitive." "She's not a fugitive. She's a mother trying to survive." "She's a thief and a liar, and when this hearing is over, she's going to jail." "Like hell she is," Grant said. Judge Briggs banged his gavel. "Mr. Calder, I will not warn you again." "Then don't," Grant said, "because I'm done being warned. This whole hearing is a sham. You're in Rufus's pocket, everyone knows it, and you're going to rule in his favor no matter what we say. So let's stop pretending this is about justice and call it what it is. A power play." The crowd erupted again, some people cheering, others shouting in outrage. Judge Briggs's face went from red to purple, and he slammed the gavel down so hard Mara thought it would split. "This hearing is adjourned," he bellowed. "Sheriff, escort Mrs. Whitlock into custody until a full trial can be arranged." "No." Tobin grabbed Mara's arm, his eyes wide with panic. The sheriff, a heavy-set man with thinning hair and a badge that looked too small for his chest, stepped forward reluctantly. "Ma'am, you need to come with me." "She's not going anywhere," Grant said, stepping between them. The sheriff's hand moved to his gun. "Mr. Calder, don't make this harder than it has to be." "I'm not making it hard. You are. That woman hasn't done anything wrong except try to protect her child. That's for the court to decide." "The court already decided," Grant said. "The second Rufus walked in here, the decision was made." The sheriff's jaw tightened. "Step aside, Grant." "No." The two men stared at each other, and for a moment Mara thought Grant was going to draw his gun. The whole room seemed to hold its breath. Then a voice called out from the back. "I got something to say." Everyone turned. A wiry man in dusty work clothes stood up, his hat clutched in his hands. Mara recognized him, one of Rufus's ranch hands, a man named Pete Dawson. Rufus's eyes narrowed. "Sit down, Pete." Pete ignored him. "I worked Vale Ranch for 3 years, and everything Mrs. Whitlock said is true. Rufus works people into the ground, pays them nothing, and keeps them trapped with debts they can't never pay off. I seen it happen to a dozen folks." Rufus's face went cold. "You're fired." "Don't care. I quit 2 months ago anyway." Pete looked at Judge Briggs. "That contract she signed? It's the same one Rufus uses on everyone. Same terms, same tricks. He gets people desperate, offers them a way out, then bleeds them dry." Another person stood up, a woman in a faded dress. "He did it to my brother. Tommy worked that ranch for 5 years trying to pay off a $100 debt. By the time he died, Rufus said he owed $2,000. Someone else stood up. "My cousin lost his land to Rufus over a loan that should have been paid off in a year." Rufus kept adding fees until my cousin couldn't afford to eat. One by one, people started standing, started talking, and the stories poured out like water from a broken dam. Stories of debts that grew instead of shrank, of contracts that trapped instead of freed, of Rufus Vale using the law as a weapon against anyone who couldn't fight back. Judge Briggs tried to restore order, but it was useless. The room was a storm now, and Mara stood in the center of it, holding her son, watching as the truth finally came to light. Rufus looked around the room, his expression murderous. Then he turned and walked out, his lawyer scrambling to follow. The door slammed behind them, and the noise in the room slowly died down. Judge Briggs sat at his desk, looking old and tired. Finally, he said, "This hearing is postponed pending further investigation. Mrs. Whitlock, you're free to go, for now." Mara let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Grant put a hand on her shoulder, and she looked up at him, her eyes wet. "Thank you," she whispered. Grant nodded. "Let's get out of here." They walked out of the town hall into the bright afternoon sun, Tobin between them. The crowd followed, spilling into the street, still talking, still arguing. Some people came up to Mara, shaking her hand, telling her they were glad she'd spoken up. Others hung back, watching with suspicious eyes. Mara didn't care. She had her son. That was all that mattered. They were halfway to the wagon when someone called out, "Mrs. Whitlock!" Mara turned. A young woman with a baby on her hip was running toward them, her face flushed. "I just wanted to say thank you," the woman said breathlessly. "My husband worked for Rufus 2 years back. Same thing happened to him. We lost everything, but nobody would listen to us. Nobody believed us, and now—" Her voice broke. "Now maybe they will." Mara reached out and squeezed the woman's hand. "I hope so." The woman nodded and hurried away, and Mara turned back to the wagon. But before they could leave, another commotion started at the end of the street. Mara looked up and saw smoke rising from the direction of the general store. "Fire!" someone shouted. People started running, and Grant cursed under his breath. "Get in the wagon." "What's happening?" Mara asked. "Nothing good." They climbed into the wagon, and Grant snapped the reins, sending the horses into a trot. As they passed the general store, Mara saw flames licking at the roof, and a crowd trying to form a bucket line. And standing across the street, watching with cold, satisfied eyes, was Rufus Vale. Grant saw him too. "That son of a—" "Don't," Mara said quickly. "Just get us out of here." Grant's jaw worked, but he kept driving. They left Ashridge Hollow behind, the smoke rising black against the blue sky, and Mara held Tobin close and tried not to think about what Rufus would do next. Back at the ranch, Voss was waiting in the yard. When he saw Tobin, his eyebrows went up. "Well," he said, "didn't expect that." "Neither did I," Mara said. Nell and June came running out of the house, and when they saw Tobin, they stopped short. "Who's that?" June asked. "This is my son," Mara said. "Tobin." Tobin looked at the two girls, then at Mara. "You got more kids?" "No, these are Mr. Calder's daughters, Nell and June." Nell stepped forward, eyeing Tobin critically. "You're skinny." "So are you," Tobin shot back. Nell grinned. "I like him." June just stared, her big eyes taking in Tobin's dirty clothes and bruised arms. Then she walked up to him and held out her wooden doll. "This is Annie," she said. "She helps when you're scared." Tobin looked at the doll, then at June. Something in his face softened. "Thanks, but I think I'm okay now." June nodded and took the doll back, and Mara felt her chest tighten. That night, after Tobin had bathed and eaten and fallen asleep on the couch, too exhausted to make it upstairs, Mara sat in the kitchen with Grant and told him everything Tobin had said. How Rufus had worked him in the stables from dawn to dusk, how he'd been fed barely enough to keep him alive, how Rufus had told him his mother was dead, that she'd run off and left him behind. "He believed it," Mara said, her voice shaking. "For 2 years he thought I'd abandoned him." Grant's expression was grim. "Rufus is going to pay for this." "How?" "You saw what happened today. Even with all those people speaking up, the judge postponed the hearing. He didn't throw it out. He's giving Rufus time to regroup." "Then we make sure he doesn't get the chance." Mara looked at him. "What are you planning?" Grant stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the dark yard. Rufus's power comes from fear. People are afraid to stand up to him because they think he's untouchable. But today, you touched him. You made people doubt him. If we keep pushing, if we keep showing people they don't have to be afraid, he'll crumble. And if he doesn't? Grant turned to face her. Then we fight him the old-fashioned way. Mara didn't like the sound of that, but she didn't argue. Because deep down, she knew Grant was right. Rufus wasn't going to stop, not unless someone stopped him. The next morning, Mara woke to the sound of horses. She ran to the window and saw a group of riders coming up the road, maybe 20 of them, all armed. Her heart stopped. She ran downstairs and found Grant already in the yard, rifle in hand. Voss stood beside him, and the ranch hands had gathered near the barn. The riders pulled up at the gate, and Mara's stomach dropped when she saw who was leading them. Rufus Vale. But this time, he wasn't alone. Beside him rode the sheriff, looking uncomfortable, and behind them were a dozen men Mara didn't recognize, rough types with guns and hard faces. "Grant Calder," Rufus called out. "I'm here to collect what's mine." "You're not taking the boy," Grant said. "I'm not here for the boy. I'm here for her." Rufus pointed at Mara. "Judge Briggs issued a warrant for her arrest. Theft, fraud, breach of contract. Sheriff's here to execute it." The sheriff shifted in his saddle. "I'm sorry, Grant. I got no choice." "There's always a choice," Grant said. The sheriff looked miserable. "Not for me." Rufus smiled. "You can make this easy or hard, Calder. Either way, she's coming with us." Mara stepped forward, her legs shaking. "I'll go." "No," Grant said. "Grant, he's got the law on his side. If I don't go, people will get hurt." "I don't care." "I do." Mara looked at him, her eyes pleading. "I care about you and those girls and this ranch. I won't let Rufus burn it all down because of me." Grant's jaw worked. "Mara, please," she whispered, "let me do this." For a long moment, Grant just stared at her. Then he lowered the rifle and stepped aside. Mara walked toward the gate, her heart pounding. Rufus watched her with cold, triumphant eyes, and when she was close enough, he leaned down from his horse. "Told you I'd win," he said softly. "This isn't over," Mara said. "Yes, it is." The sheriff dismounted and pulled out a pair of iron shackles. Mara held out her hands, and he locked them around her wrists, his face apologetic. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he muttered. Mara didn't respond. She just turned and looked back at the ranch one last time. Grant stood in the yard, his face hard as stone. Tobin was on the porch, held back by Voss, his face streaked with tears. Nell and June stood beside him, their small hands clutching his. Mara tried to memorize the sight, tried to burn it into her mind so she'd never forget. Then the sheriff helped her onto a horse, and they rode away. The jail in Ashridge Hollow was a small, squat building with 2 cells and a roof that leaked when it rained. Mara sat on a narrow cot in the back cell, staring at the wall, and tried not to think about what came next. The trial would be a formality. Judge Briggs would rule in Rufus's favor, and Mara would be sent to the territorial prison for 5, maybe 10 years. By the time she got out, Tobin would be grown. Nell and June would have forgotten her. Grant would move on. The thought made her chest ache. She heard footsteps and looked up. The sheriff stood outside her cell, keys in hand. "You got a visitor," he said. He unlocked the door and Grant walked in. Mara stood up, her throat tight. "You shouldn't be here." "Too bad." Grant sat on the cot and gestured for her to sit beside him. Mara hesitated, then did. For a while they didn't speak. Then Grant said, "Tobin's doing okay. Nell's been keeping him busy. June gave him her doll." Mara smiled despite herself. Of course she did. "He's a good kid. Strong. Like his mother." "I'm not strong," Mara said quietly. "I gave up. I let Rufus take me without a fight." "You didn't give up. You protected the people you love. That's not weakness. That's strength." Mara looked at him. "What happens now?" "Now we wait for the trial, and we hope the people who spoke up yesterday have the courage to do it again. And if they don't," Grant's expression was grim, "then we make them." Mara shook her head. "You can't force people to be brave." "No, but you can give them a reason to try." He stood up and walked to the cell door, then paused. "I'm not letting you go, Mara. Not to Rufus, not to prison, not to anyone. You hear me?" Mara's eyes burned. "Grant, you're part of this family now, and we don't leave family behind." He walked out, and the door clanged shut behind him, and Mara sat alone in the cell with her hands shaking and hope flickering in her chest like a candle in the wind. The trial was set for 3 days later. 3 days that stretched like years in that cramped, damp cell. The sheriff brought Mara food twice a day, plain bread and watery stew, and she ate without tasting it. At night, she lay on the cot and listened to the sounds of Ashridge Hollow settling into sleep, and she thought about all the ways this could go wrong. On the second day, Tobin came to visit. The sheriff let him into the cell, and Mara pulled him into her arms and held him until he squirmed. "You're squishing me," he said, but he didn't pull away. "I know. I don't care." They sat together on the cot, and Tobin told her about the ranch, how Nell had taught him to play cards and beaten him 3 times in a row, how June followed him everywhere and barely spoke but seemed to understand everything, how Voss had put him to work mucking out stalls and said he was slow but getting better. "Mr. Calder says you're going to be okay," Tobin said. "He says the trial's just a formality, and you'll come home after." Mara's throat tightened. "Did he?" "Yeah, he says Rufus is a bully, and bullies always lose in the end. Mr. Calder's an optimist." Tobin looked at her with serious eyes. "Are you going to lose, Mama?" Mara wanted to lie, wanted to tell him everything would be fine, that she'd be home in a few days, and they'd never have to think about Rufus Vale again. But she'd spent too many years lying to herself, and she wasn't going to start lying to her son. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I hope not." Tobin nodded slowly. "If you do lose, I'll wait for you. However long it takes." Mara's eyes burned. "You're a good boy, Tobin." "I'm not a boy anymore. I'm almost 11. You'll always be my boy." Tobin rolled his eyes, but he leaned against her shoulder, and they sat like that until the sheriff came to tell him visiting time was over. The night before the trial, Mara couldn't sleep. She paced the cell, her mind spinning through every possible outcome, every argument Rufus's lawyer would make, every way the judge could rule against her. Around midnight, she heard footsteps. She looked up and saw Grant standing outside the cell, a lantern in his hand. "What are you doing here?" she asked. "Couldn't sleep." "That makes 2 of us." Grant set the lantern on the floor and sat on the bench across from her cell. For a while they didn't speak. Then he said, "I talked to some people today, folks who've had dealings with Rufus, got them to agree to testify." Mara's heart lifted. "How many?" 7, maybe 8 if Pete Dawson's cousin shows up. "That's good. That's really good." "It's something," Grant said. "But I won't lie to you, Mara. Judge Briggs doesn't want to rule against Rufus. It's going to take more than testimony to sway him." "Then what will it take?" Grant looked at her, his gray eyes steady. "The truth. All of it. Not just about Rufus, but about you. About why you stayed as long as you did, why you didn't fight back sooner. People need to understand that you're not a criminal. You're a mother who got trapped by a system that was designed to keep her down." Mara sank onto the cot. "I'm scared, Grant. What if I stand up there and tell my story and nobody believes me?" "Then at least you told it. At least you tried." "That's not very comforting." Grant smiled faintly. "I'm not very good at comfort." Despite everything, Mara laughed. It was a small, broken sound, but it was real. Grant stood up and picked up the lantern. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be a long day." "Grant?" He paused. "Thank you," Mara said, "for everything." Grant nodded. "Don't thank me yet. Thank me when this is over." The courtroom was packed, every seat filled, people standing along the walls, crowding in the doorway. Mara sat at the same table as before, her hands folded in her lap, trying to keep them from shaking. Grant sat beside her, solid and steady, and just having him there made it a little easier to breathe. Rufus sat across the aisle with his lawyer, looking calm and confident. He caught Mara's eye and smiled, and she looked away. Judge Briggs entered, and everyone stood. He took his seat, banged his gavel once, and said, "This court is now in session. We are here to determine the validity of the charges against Mrs. Mara Whitlock, theft, fraud, and breach of contract. Mr. Vale, your opening statement." Rufus's lawyer stood, smoothing his jacket. He was good at this, Mara could tell. Smooth and polished, with a voice that carried authority. "Your Honor, this is a simple case. Mrs. Whitlock entered into a legally binding contract with my client. She failed to fulfill the terms of that contract, and upon discovering she could not pay her debts, chose to steal from Mr. Vale and flee. We have documentation, witnesses, and a signed contract. The facts are clear. He sat down and Judge Briggs turned to Mara. Mrs. Whitlock, do you have representation? Mara stood up. No, Your Honor, just myself. Then you may make your opening statement. Mara's mouth was dry. She looked out at the crowd, all those faces, all those eyes, and felt her courage waver. Then she saw Tobin sitting in the front row, flanked by Nell and June, and something steadied inside her. Your Honor, she began, her voice shaking, I did sign a contract with Rufus Vale, and I did take food from his stores, but I didn't steal. I was trying to survive, and I was trying to keep my son alive. She took a breath and continued, Rufus Vale preys on people who have nothing left to lose. He offers them hope, and then he traps them. He did it to me, and he's done it to dozens of others. And if I don't stand up and tell the truth now, he's going to keep doing it. She sat down, her legs trembling, and Grant reached over and squeezed her hand. Judge Briggs nodded. Mr. Vale, call your first witness. The lawyer called the foreman from Rufus's ranch, a man named Garrett, who testified that Mara had worked there for 6 months and had been caught stealing supplies. He was calm, credible, and damning. Next came Rufus's accountant, who presented ledgers showing the debts Mara had accrued and the items she'd allegedly stolen. The numbers were staggering, $300, just like the lawyer had said. When it was Mara's turn to cross-examine, she stood up and said, Mr. Garrett, did Mr. Vale ever tell you how much I was being paid? Garrett shifted. You weren't being paid, ma'am. You were working off a debt. And how much was that debt when I started? $50, I believe. $50. And how much did Mr. Vale say I owed when I left? Garrett hesitated. I don't recall the exact amount. Mara picked up the ledger and read aloud. $347. In 6 months, my debt went from $50 to over $300. How is that possible? Room and board, ma'am. Supplies. Interest. Interest at 20% per month. That's usury, Mr. Garrett. That's not legal. Rufus's lawyer stood up. Objection. Mrs. Whitlock is not qualified to make legal determinations. Sustained, Judge Briggs said. Mrs. Whitlock, stick to questions. Mara bit back her frustration and sat down. The lawyer called 2 more witnesses, both employees of Rufus, who testified that Mara had been difficult, uncooperative, and ultimately dishonest. By the time they were done, Mara felt like she'd been buried under an avalanche. Then it was her turn. Grant had gathered 8 people willing to testify, and one by one, they stood up and told their stories. Pete Dawson talked about the contracts that never ended, the debts that only grew. A woman named Sarah told the court how Rufus had foreclosed on her family's land over a loan her father had taken out years ago. A man named Jacob described working 18-hour days on Rufus's ranch and still being told he owed more than when he started. With each story, the mood in the room shifted. People started murmuring, shifting in their seats. Rufus's expression grew darker. Finally, Mara called Tobin to the stand. He walked up slowly, his thin shoulders squared, and sat in the witness chair. He looked small up there, younger than his 10 years, but his eyes were fierce. State your name, Judge Briggs said. Tobin Whitlock. And you're Mrs. Whitlock's son? Yes, sir. Tell us what happened when you went to live with Mr. Vale. Tobin glanced at Rufus, then back at the judge. He said my mama owed him money, and I had to work it off. He put me in the stables. I worked from sunup to sundown, 6 days a week, sometimes 7. How old were you? 8. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Judge Briggs frowned. And what were you paid? Nothing. He said it was going toward the debt. Did Mr. Vale ever tell you when the debt would be paid off? No, sir. He just said I had to keep working. Mara watched her son, her chest so tight she could barely breathe. He was doing so well, so much braver than she'd ever been. Rufus's lawyer stood up. Your Honor, the boy is clearly biased. The boy is a witness, Judge Briggs said sharply. Sit down. The lawyer sat, his face tight. Judge Briggs looked at Tobin. Did Mr. Vale ever mistreat you? Tobin hesitated. He hit me sometimes, when I messed up, and he didn't give me enough food. I was hungry all the time. Why didn't you run away sooner? Because he said if I left, he'd find my mama and hurt her, and I believed him. The room was dead silent. Even Judge Briggs looked shaken. "Thank you, Tobin," Mara said softly. "You can step down." Tobin walked back to his seat, and Nell reached over and squeezed his hand. Finally, Mara stood up. "Your Honor, I'd like to testify." Judge Briggs nodded. "Proceed." Mara walked to the witness stand and sat down. Her hands were shaking, and she gripped the armrest to steady them. "Mrs. Whitlock," Judge Briggs said, "tell us, in your own words, what happened." Mara took a breath. "I was desperate. My husband had died, I had a child to feed, and I didn't have any family or friends to turn to. Rufus offered me work, and I took it because I didn't have a choice. Or at least, I thought I didn't." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I signed that contract because Rufus told me it was the only way. He stood over me while I signed it, rushing me, telling me not to worry about the details. I didn't read it. I should have, but I didn't, and that's on me." Her voice grew stronger. "But what Rufus did after, that's on him. He worked me until I couldn't stand. He kept adding charges to the debt, things I never agreed to, and when I couldn't pay, he took my son. He told me Tobin was collateral, like he was a piece of furniture instead of a human being." Tears streamed down her face, but she didn't wipe them away. "I stole food because my son was starving. I took money because I was trying to buy our way out. And I ran because I didn't know what else to do. I'm not proud of any of it, but I'm not ashamed either, because I did what I had to do to protect my child." She looked directly at Judge Briggs. "Rufus Vale is a predator. He uses the law as a weapon, and he destroys anyone who gets in his way. If you let him win today, you're telling every desperate person in this county that the law doesn't protect them, that it only protects people like him." She stood up and walked back to her seat, her legs shaking so badly she nearly stumbled. Grant caught her arm and steadied her. "That was good," he whispered. "Really good." Judge Briggs sat in silence for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then he said, "I'm going to call a recess. We'll reconvene in 1 hour." The courtroom erupted into conversation as people filed out. Mara stayed seated, too drained to move. Grant leaned over. "You did everything you could. Now we wait." "I'm scared," Mara admitted. "I know, but you're not alone." The hour felt like an eternity. Mara stood outside the courthouse with Grant and the kids, watching the townspeople mill around. Some of them gave her sympathetic looks. Others avoided her eyes entirely. Then she saw something that made her stomach drop. Rufus was standing near his horse, talking to Judge Briggs. The two men were too far away for Mara to hear, but she could see Rufus gesturing, his expression intense. Judge Briggs nodded once, then walked away. "He's bribing him," Mara said flatly. Grant followed her gaze. "Maybe. Or maybe the judge is just telling him to back off. You don't believe that." "No," Grant admitted. "I don't." When the hour was up, everyone filed back inside. Judge Briggs took his seat, and the room fell silent. "I've reviewed the evidence," he began, "and I've heard testimony from both sides. This is not an easy case." Mara's heart pounded. "However," Judge Briggs continued, "the law is clear. A contract is binding, regardless of whether the signer understood its terms. Mrs. Whitlock signed an agreement with Mr. Vale, and she failed to fulfill it. That constitutes breach of contract." Mara's chest hollowed out. "But," Judge Briggs said, and the word hung in the air like a lifeline, "I am also troubled by the terms of that contract. Interest rates of 20% per month are, in my opinion, unconscionable. And the testimony regarding Mr. Vale's treatment of the boy raises serious concerns." He looked at Rufus. "Mr. Vale, I am dismissing the charges of theft and fraud. However, I am ordering you to forgive the debt owed by Mrs. Whitlock and to pay restitution to her son in the amount of $500 for labor performed without compensation." The courtroom erupted. Rufus shot to his feet, his face purple. "That's outrageous." "That's my ruling," Judge Briggs said. "And if you don't like it, you can appeal. But I suspect an appeal will bring more scrutiny to your business practices than you'd prefer." Rufus stared at him, his jaw working. Then he turned and stormed out of the courtroom, his lawyer scrambling after him. Judge Briggs banged his gavel. "This case is closed. Mrs. Whitlock, you're free to go." Mara sat frozen, unable to process what had just happened. Then Grant pulled her to her feet, and Tobin ran forward and threw his arms around her, and the reality of it hit her all at once. She'd won. Outside, people crowded around, shaking her hand, congratulating her. Some apologized for not speaking up sooner. Others just smiled and walked away. Mara barely registered any of it. She held Tobin's hand and looked at Grant, and he gave her a small, tired smile. "Told you," he said. "Bullies always lose." "Not always," Mara said, "but today they did." The ride back to the ranch was quiet. Tobin sat between Mara and Grant, his head nodding with exhaustion, and Nell and June chattered in the back of the wagon about what they'd cook for dinner to celebrate. When they pulled into the yard, Voss was waiting. He looked at Mara, then at Grant, then said, "So she's staying?" "She's staying," Grant said. Voss grunted. "Guess I'll have to get used to it." "Guess so." Voss walked away, and Mara almost laughed. That night, Mara cooked a feast: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, biscuits, and pie made from the last of the preserved apples. The whole house smelled like warmth and home, and when they sat down to eat, everyone talked over each other, laughing and arguing and reaching for seconds. After dinner, the kids went outside to play, and Mara stood at the sink washing dishes. Grant came up beside her and picked up a towel to dry. "You don't have to do that," Mara said. "I know." They worked in companionable silence for a while. Then Grant said, "You know, the girls were terrified you wouldn't come back." "Were they?" "Nell tried to act tough, but I could tell. And June, she cried herself to sleep the first night." Mara's throat tightened. "I'm sorry." "Don't be. They needed to know you'd come back. And you did." Mara set down the dish she was washing and looked at him. "I meant what I said in court. I'm not running anymore. This is home now. If you'll have me." Grant set down the towel. "Mara, I've been alone a long time, so have the girls. We got used to it. Got good at it even. But these past few weeks," he paused, searching for words, "you changed something. Made this place feel like more than just a ranch. Made it feel like a family." "Grant, I'm not good with words," he said, "but I want you to stay. Not as a cook or a housekeeper, as part of this family. For real." Mara's eyes filled with tears. "I'd like that." Grant nodded, his expression soft. "Good. Then it's settled." He picked up the towel again and went back to drying dishes, and Mara stood there for a moment, letting the weight of everything settle over her. She'd lost so much: her husband, her home, years with her son. But she'd found something too, something she'd thought was gone forever, a place to belong. A month later, Mara stood in the yard watching Tobin and Nell race across the field, June trailing behind them with a kite string in her hand. The sky was wide and blue, and the wind carried the smell of fresh-cut hay. Grant came up beside her, wiping sweat from his forehead. "They're going to run themselves into the ground. Let them. They're happy." "So are you." Mara looked at him. "Yeah, I am." Grant smiled, a real smile, rare and precious, and Mara felt something settle deep in her chest. Peace, maybe. Or just the simple knowledge that she'd fought for this and won. Word about the trial had spread, and in the weeks that followed, more people came forward with stories about Rufus Vale. The territorial governor launched an investigation into his business practices, and several of his contracts were voided. Rufus's empire didn't crumble overnight, but it cracked. And cracks, Mara knew, had a way of spreading. She didn't know what would happen to Rufus in the end, and she found she didn't care. He'd lost his hold on her, and that was enough. One evening, as the sun dipped low and turned the sky orange and gold, Mara sat on the porch with Grant and watched the kids play. Voss had even joined them, teaching Tobin how to throw a lasso, though he grumbled the whole time. "You think this will last?" Mara asked quietly. Grant looked at her. "What, the peace?" "All of it, this feeling, this family." Grant was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Nothing lasts forever. But that doesn't mean it's not worth having." Mara nodded. He was right. Life didn't come with guarantees. You couldn't control what happened to you, or who walked into your life, or how long they stayed. All you could do was fight for the people you loved, and hope it was enough. And for Mara, standing on that porch with the people who'd become her family, it was more than enough. It was everything. The house had changed, not in any big, obvious way, but in the small things. There were always boots by the door now. Tobin's too big, June's too small, all of them muddied and worn. The kitchen table bore the scars of 100 meals, knife marks and spills, and the faint ring from where Nell always set her milk glass. The walls echoed with voices, arguments, laughter, the everyday noise of people living together. Mara had stopped counting the days. She no longer measured time by how long she'd been running or how long she had left. She measured it in the way June reached for her hand when they crossed the yard, in the way Tobin called her mama without hesitation, in the way Grant looked at her across the table when he thought she wasn't watching. She'd learned something in those hard months, that family wasn't about blood or perfection. It was about showing up, even when it was hard. It was about staying, even when leaving would be easier. It was about fighting for each other, not because you had to, but because you couldn't imagine doing anything else. And so Ashridge Hollow, that brutal frontier town that had nearly broken her, became the place where Mara Whitlock finally stopped running and started living. Not a perfect life, not an easy one, but hers. And in the end, that was all that mattered.